Hi. One of the things that I think sometimes makes it complicated for people to imagine more collaborative and co-equal models of leadership is that sometimes we struggle to imagine that you could trust your coworker enough to share an authority role with them co-equally. Because I think, right, like, that's a countercultural concept, right? The idea, group projects are hard. I think we've all been burned by an experience of shared work, but that this collaborative model, right, it reflects our values. So the Unitarian Universalist Association recently kind of re-articulated our values, and under the value of interdependence, right, they say this is a promise of a vision statement for who we are as Unitarian Universalists, is we will create and nurture sustainable relationships of care and respect, mutuality and justice. We will work to repair harm and damaged relationships. And that I'll say why that feels for me that this Sunday so urgent as work for the two of us and for this congregation. And then I want to hear why it's urgent for you. Which is that there is so much that is unknown right now about what the future of our community, our country, our world looks like. It's just very deeply uncertain right now. And I would say that there are, that the folks who are more marginalized or more at risk are feeling the uncertainty much more acutely than others. And so I think that, but that this congregation has over and over again declared a set of values around welcoming our immigrant neighbors, around embracing LGBTQ people, around the inherent holiness of trans and non-binary people, right? Like, we have made those declarations over and over and over again, but that living out those values is maybe gonna, right, that much of our advocacy, or some of our advocacy around those things, has been about changing laws to reflect our values. And I don't know how much of that kind of advocacy is really gonna be part of our next phase of life together. Maybe at the local level, I think it will be, but at the national level, that's not what's happening. What's happening in the national scheme of things is that we are going to have to get really, really clear about how what is moral and what is legal are two different things. And that requires a lot of trust within a community. To be like, yes, we authorize you to break the law on behalf of our values. Or like, you need a lot of trust to make that work. And so for me, that is the urgency that I feel, is that for you and I to trust each other and for all of us to trust each other, because right, this is where I'm I'm like the person with the sandwich board and the bell, right? I'm the alarmist between the two of us. Good thing there's not two alarmists, just one. But that's the urgency that I feel. And so I'm curious, Christina, what feels urgent about trust between you and I and in this community right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I think about creating trust, as I said after we did the Wonder Box, trust starts at the most local level. And if you look at, the trust writ large in our nation right now, it's at an all-time low. There's a recent Pew Research study that shows that people in our nation have a very low trust of institutions in particular, our government, our healthcare systems, our education system, churches. They don't have any sense of trust. And one thought I have about that is partly that so much of the relationships with those institutions has broken down at a more local level. People don't know who is making decisions for their local school system, or they don't know, it's not just about their relationship with their doctor, it's a relationship with the entire government around healthcare, or, big pharma or something like that. And so coming back down to the granular local level is what we've always been about here at the fellowship. If you ask almost anyone why they started coming to the fellowship, the first word they will say is community. And creating a hyper-local community where we can trust each other on a sort of one-to-one level. And I think, if we've always tried to strive for that, the idea that we've imported a leadership model that is more hierarchical doesn't make sense. And so we've been working for the last couple of years to create our governance structure to be a more shared relational model between the governing board, the congregation, and the executive team, but also sharing the ministry equally just makes more sense for those values of mutuality that our values already name.
Yeah, well, and I just want to like tug on the thread about institutional trust, because that's another fascinating part about doing Unitarian Universalist ministry, is that there are some of us who grew up in a congregation like this with pluralism and like a social justice right at the heart of our experience of institutional religion, but many of you did not grow up with pluralism and social justice at the heart of your experience of institutional religion. And so part of this ministry is also figuring out like how can we shape a religious community that earns your trust, right? That puts enough marbles in the jar that whatever path you have tread before this one, you can trust the ministers, you can trust this community. And the other piece to just think about that deterioration of trust in institutions is also, or I should say, one of the things that makes it complicated for me, and especially complicated in whatever this world that we're entering is, right, is that some of the breakdown of trust in institutions, I think about like big pharma as the example, right, that some of that breakdown in trust is because of deliberate misinformation that has been shared. Right, but like some of that breakdown in trust is because people we trusted did bad things. Right, like if you think about the Sackler family and the opioid epidemic, right? They did some things that would break our trust, and that historically, and there's also been breaches of trust with vulnerable communities. So before we moved here, and before I lived in Wyoming, I lived in Baltimore for many years, where the story of Henrietta Lacks and the ways that healthcare and research and communities of color, right, like that there is history of an abuse of trust and an abuse of power that there's reasons that people don't trust institutions sometimes, and it's not just because of deliberate misinformation. And so it's that piece about sorting out, is that somehow we have to figure out how to move forward in our ability to sort out who to trust and when in a way that's going to be like a totally different alignment than many of us are used to.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's I don't know, that wasn't
yes.
Yay, hard work ahead.
And one of the things that Hannah and I always sort of joke about, but it's an excellent metaphor. Do you remember the show Scooby-Doo? You know how at the end they would always be they'd pull off the mask and be like, "You again."
It was the janitor.
It was Mr. Goobers again, whenever we get to sort of collective mistrust, it's almost always capitalism. It's like you pull off the mask, it's like, "You again, capitalism."
Well, and you again, the idea that our worth is tied up with our productivity or monetary output.
Yeah. So what, not capitalism as an effective economic system, but sort of late stage greed based, extractive capitalism is sort of like underlying. So, if we could point to the Sackler family and say they made poor decisions that led to the lack of trust, but what was that about? It was about money. Right? When we look at the immigration system or the prison industrial complex or all these places where trust has eroded, underneath it all, you pull the mask off and it's often about money. And money and the economy played a huge role in the results of the most recent election. And I wish I could say that we don't have anything to do with that here at the fellowship, that we don't have any anxiety about money. But that's just not true. It's not true.
Nope.
We do have to pay our bills. We still live in a capitalist society. We still have to have people give money. All those things. And that sometimes can create an environment of anxiety, like Marty was talking about with the Capitol campaign thing, and anxiety got really high, and people started mistrusting each other. So sort of just naming it, that's a piece of the puzzle, and that we are trying to live in this countercultural way that centers our values of mutuality and respect, and yet we still live in a society governed by laws that we might have to break and bills that we have to pay. It's a challenge,
Yeah.
but creating that trust with each other, open communication, honest communication, direct communication with each other and with us. I'm gonna say that again. Direct communication is how we build trust.
Well, and the thinking about that, right, like that tension you named between here are the values we are aspiring to live in the world, and here is the world we live in, and we're trying to navigate the gap between those two things. This is where I want to point us to sort of the piece. Can you talk about the tattoo that's on the inside of your left wrist? You're you all are
yes.
like, what a hard turn.
I have 4 words tattooed on my left wrist. I'm left-handed, so it's the one I see the most. And it says, "All will be well." And those words come to us from a very early mystic, Christian mystic, who was a woman, and she would have these mystical experiences where she would sort of commune with God. And spoiler alert, anytime people have mystical experiences where they commune with God, they feel an inherent oneness with everything. Not one person ever comes back from a mystical experience and is like, oh, we should have more borders, more separations. Like, that just never happens. And she wrote that all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. And she didn't mean today, in the, whatever it was, 1400s or whatever.
Julian of Norwich.
Julian of Norwich, but she meant sort of in the grand cosmic scale. Because right now, there will be ramifications. There will be ramifications for real people, and it will not be well. That will not be well. So I don't want to belittle it and be like, it's all gonna be fine. But in the grand cosmic scope, we are held by love, we are held by the universe, we are held by God, and that's why I remind myself, and actually right now, I had a couple hospitalizations recently, so these are literally pockmarked with IV lines. Like, it didn't feel like it would be well a couple weeks ago. But right now I'm here and I'm fine, and I believe deeply that we can create the relationships and be the microcosm that we want to spin out, fractal out into the world.
Yeah. And sometimes all the talking words aren't enough, or they're insufficient in this moment, and we turn to poetry. So this is a poem called Trust by Thomas R. Smith. It's like so many other things in life to which you must say no or yes. So you take your car to the new mechanic. Sometimes the best thing to do is to trust. The package left with the disreputable-looking clerk, the check gulped by the night deposit, the envelope passed by dozens of strangers, all show up at their intended destinations. The theft that could have happened but doesn't. Wind finally gets where it was going through the snowy trees, and the river, even when frozen, arrives at the right place. And sometimes you sense how faithfully your life is delivered, even though you can't read the address.